Mark Sullivan stared at the glowing screen of his laptop, the blue light illuminating his tired face in the darkness of his Chicago apartment. Another winter storm raged outside, the wind howling against his windows like a hungry beast trying to claw its way inside. At 42, he felt trapped, not just by the blizzard but by the life he had carefully constructed that now felt like a prison of his own making. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 months ago, ending a 15-year marriage that had gradually dissolved into polite indifference. His corporate job developing software for a financial services company paid well but drained his soul with each passing day of meaningless meetings and office politics. Something had to change. The Philippines hadn't been his first choice. In fact, it hadn't been on his radar at all until a random YouTube algorithm suggested a video about American expatriates living in Manila. One video led to another, and soon Mark found himself falling down a rabbit hole of sun-drenched beaches, vibrant city streets, and stories of Americans who had reinvented themselves in this Southeast Asian archipelago. The cost of living would allow his savings to stretch much further than in the States. His job had become remote during the pandemic and had stayed that way. His boss cared only about deadlines being met, not about which time zone the work came from. "Could I really do this?" Mark whispered to himself, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as he scrolled through apartment listings in Manila and Cebu. The faces of smiling Filipino women on dating sites also caught his attention. Was it possible to find love again at his age, in a completely different culture? He had read stories of American men finding devoted partners in the Philippines, though something about some of these accounts made him uneasy, a hint of transactional undertones that didn't align with what he was seeking. Still, the idea took root and grew stronger with each passing day. Mark began researching visa requirements, banking arrangements, and healthcare options. He joined Facebook groups for expatriates in the Philippines, absorbing their tips and warnings alike. The more he planned, the more real the possibility became, and with it came a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Excitement, tinged with fear, but genuine excitement nonetheless. His friends reacted with mixtures of concern and envy when he finally shared his plans. "You're having a midlife crisis," his best friend Dave declared over beers. "Buy a sports car like a normal person." His sister was more supportive but worried about the distance. "What if something happens to Mom? You'll be on the other side of the world." Valid concerns, but they paled against the growing conviction that if he didn't make this change now, he never would. 3 months later, Mark had sold most of his possessions, arranged for long-term storage of sentimental items, secured a 6-month lease on a condominium in Makati, Manila's business district, and purchased a one-way ticket. Standing in his empty apartment on his final night in Chicago, he felt strangely light, unburdened. The snowstorm outside had finally ceased, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the occasional drip of melting ice. Was he making the biggest mistake of his life, or was he finally, after decades of playing it safe, taking a chance on something extraordinary? What would be waiting for him across the ocean? Disappointment, danger, or perhaps the sense of purpose and connection that had eluded him for so long? As he closed his apartment door for the final time, Mark realized there was only one way to find out. Have you ever reached a point in your life where the familiar became unbearable? Where the path of least resistance suddenly seemed like the most painful option? Mark Sullivan had, and as his plane lifted off American soil the next day, he wondered how many others were trapped in lives they had outgrown, dreams deferred until they faded into regrets. Perhaps his journey would inspire others to take their own leap of faith, or serve as a cautionary tale. Either way, his story was now irrevocably changing course, heading west across the Pacific toward an uncertain future in a land of 7,000 islands. The heat hit Mark like a physical blow as he stepped out of Ninoy Aquino International Airport. Nothing had prepared him for Manila's wall of humidity that instantly plastered his clothes to his skin. The cacophony of sounds assaulted his senses. Car horns, street vendors, and the buzz of 13 million inhabitants. "Taxi, sir?" A man approached him. Mark hesitated, remembering warnings about airport scams. He walked toward the official taxi stand, dragging his 2 suitcases. all that remained of his life in America. The drive to Makati became a lesson in Manila's economic contrasts. They passed sprawling slums with metal shacks stacked upon one another, then gleaming shopping malls with luxury storefronts. The disconnect was jarring, and Mark wondered where he would fit into this social ecosystem. His condo building featured a uniformed doorman and a lobby that aimed for opulence, though showing wear. The apartment was smaller than it had appeared. Online, a common experience he would learn, but clean and furnished with basics. His view revealed concrete buildings rather than the partial ocean view promised. That night, sleep eluded Mark despite his fatigue. Unfamiliar sounds penetrated the walls, distant music, shouts in Tagalog, persistent honking. The air conditioning rattled but provided relief from heat. Had he made a colossal mistake? The magnitude of leaving everything familiar crashed over him in waves of anxiety. The next morning brought new challenges. His phone plan didn't work despite the international package purchased. The shower produced either scalding water or none. Breakfast became an adventure when he encountered menu items like tapsilog with no idea what they contained. His coffee came syrupy sweet without asking. Grocery shopping proved equally disorienting. The supermarket carried familiar brands at surprisingly high prices, while local alternatives were cheaper but mysterious. What was calamansi, and why was it in everything from juice to soap? Why were eggs unrefrigerated? By week's end, Mark had encountered more obstacles than anticipated. In a month. His internet connection was frustratingly unreliable. The power briefly went out 3 times. He had met only one American expat, a retired military man with uncomfortable colonial attitudes about how things worked here. What bothered Mark most was the profound loneliness. Despite millions of people around, he had yet to have a conversation beyond transactional exchanges. Service workers were unfailingly polite, but that politeness created distance rather than connection. When he smiled at people, they often looked away. Contrary to the friendly locals he had read about, had he fundamentally misunderstood what awaited him? How long before this alien place would feel remotely like home? Was it possible to build authentic relationships when he stood out so visibly as a foreigner? These questions haunted Mark as he watched the sunset paint Manila's smoggy sky in orange and purple. Below him, the city continued its rhythm, indifferent to his presence, carrying on as it had for centuries before he arrived and would after he left. The turning point for Mark came unexpectedly, 3 weeks into his Filipino adventure, when his laptop finally gave up after years of faithful service. Panic set in immediately. Without his computer, he couldn't work, and without work, this entire experiment would collapse. The sleek electronics mall his building's doorman recommended was crowded with locals browsing smartphones and gadgets. Mark felt completely out of his element as he navigated through narrow aisles between vendor stalls. "You look lost," a voice said behind him. Mark turned to find a woman in her 30s smiling at him. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "I'm Anna. Are you looking for something specific?" Relief washed over Mark as he explained his laptop situation. Anna worked as an IT specialist at a local bank and offered to help him navigate the mall's complex ecosystem, where bargaining was expected and knowing which vendors were trustworthy made all the difference. "Americans always pay too much," she told him with a laugh that held no judgment, just amusement at a cultural truth. Over coffee, after securing his new laptop, at a price Anna assured him was fair, Mark found himself sharing more about his relocation struggles than he'd intended. Anna listened attentively, occasionally nodding in understanding. "The Philippines you see in YouTube videos isn't the real Philippines," she said. "Those people show what tourists want to see, not what it's like to actually live here." Anna became Mark's unofficial cultural translator. She explained unspoken social rules he'd been unknowingly violating, like how his direct American communication style came across as rude and why people looked away when he smiled. Prolonged eye contact with strangers, especially from foreigners, could be misinterpreted. She introduced him to authentic Filipino food beyond tourist menus, teaching him to appreciate the complex flavors of adobo and sinigang. Through Anna's network, Mark found a reliable internet provider and a better apartment in a quieter neighborhood. Most importantly, she introduced him to her friends, a diverse group of young professionals who welcomed him without the excessive deference he'd encountered elsewhere, or the suspicion that he was just another foreigner looking for a vacation romance. "Why are you helping me?" Mark asked Anna one evening as they watched the sunset from a rooftop bar in Poblacion. She considered the question carefully before answering. "My cousin married an American and moved to California. When she visited last year, she told me how difficult it was adjusting there, how people assumed she married for a green card. No one helped her navigate American culture. I guess I'm helping you because I wish someone had helped her." This honest answer shifted something in Mark's perspective. He'd been so focused on his own struggles that he hadn't considered the courage of Filipinos who made the reverse journey, facing even greater cultural and economic gaps. Was his frustration partly rooted in the expectation that the world should accommodate him, rather than the other way around? With Anna's friendship as an anchor, Mark began making genuine efforts to adapt. He took Tagalog lessons, learned to navigate the jeepneys and trains of Manila's chaotic transportation system, and discovered the unwritten protocols of daily Filipino life. The city slowly transformed from an incomprehensible maze into a place with its own internal logic, still foreign, but increasingly navigable. The relationship between Mark and Anna evolved gradually. He was careful not to misinterpret her kindness as romantic interest, mindful of the power dynamics between an American man and a local woman. She seemed equally cautious, perhaps because of experiences with other foreigners who had different expectations. They circled each other with mutual respect, building trust through shared experiences and honest conversations about cultural differences. When Anna finally agreed to have dinner at his apartment, Mark spent the entire day preparing, determined to show that he had learned something about Filipino hospitality. The meal wasn't perfect. His attempt at chicken adobo lacked the depth, curve flavor her mother's recipe had, but the effort itself communicated something important. As they sat on his balcony afterward, the city lights twinkling below them, Mark realized he was no longer just surviving in Manila, he was beginning to live there. The persistent question remained, however, was this a temporary chapter or the beginning of a new life? And what role would Anna play in that story? Only time would reveal those answers, but for the first time since arriving, Mark was genuinely curious to find out, rather than anxious about the unknown. 6 months into his Philippine journey, Mark faced a critical decision. His initial 6-month lease was ending, and his company was pressuring him to return to Chicago for an important project. This crossroads forced him to examine what he truly wanted: the comfortable familiarity of his old life, or the challenging unpredictability of his new one. His relationship with Anna had deepened cautiously. They saw each other several times weekly, exploring Manila together and occasionally venturing to nearby provinces where Mark discovered a Philippines rarely seen by tourists: ancestral homes in small villages, hidden waterfalls reached by trekking through jungle paths, and beaches unmarred by commercial development. These experiences revealed a country far more complex and beautiful than the limited version he'd first encountered. "My family wants to meet you," Anna mentioned casually one evening as they walked along Manila Bay. The statement carried weight. In Filipino culture, as Mark had learned, family gatherings weren't casual affairs, but evaluations with multiple generations weighing in on potential partners. "Just as friends," she added quickly, perhaps sensing his momentary hesitation. The gathering took place at her parents' modest home in Quezon City. Mark arrived bearing carefully selected gifts. Specific fruits and cakes Anna had advised would be appropriate. The house was smaller than he expected, with 3 generations living under one roof. Extended family members appeared throughout the day, each introducing themselves and studying him with undisguised curiosity. Anna's father, a retired school principal, questioned Mark directly about his intentions in the Philippines. "Many Americans come here looking only for vacation girlfriends," he stated, watching Mark's reaction carefully. Her mother was warmer, but equally observant, insisting he try every dish prepared for the occasion. Her younger brothers alternated between skepticism and fascination with his stories about American life. Throughout the day, Mark noticed subtle dynamics he would have missed months earlier. The deference shown to grandparents, the significance of who was served first, the indirect ways opinions were expressed through glances rather than words. Most revealing was how differently Anna behaved here. More reserved than when they were alone, clearly navigating her role as daughter while still being his cultural interpreter. Later that night, alone in his apartment, Mark reflected on the experience. The family gathering had crystallized something important. Relationships here weren't just between two individuals, but between entire family networks. If he pursued something deeper with Anna, he wouldn't just be dating her, but entering a complex web of obligations and expectations, vastly different from American individualism. His company's deadline for a decision loomed. They had been patient but needed commitment. Several colleagues had emailed about opportunities and office politics he was missing. His sister called regularly, updating him on their mother's minor health issues, nothing serious but reminders of responsibilities left behind. Mark found himself mapping two potential futures, returning to a life where he understood the rules but felt unfulfilled, or committing to building something new in a place where he would always be partially an outsider. The financial reality was also stark. Living as an American in the Philippines meant navigating an uncomfortable economic disparity. His monthly rent exceeded what many Filipinos earned in a year, a fact that created an unspoken barrier between himself and most locals. His relationship with Anna further complicated matters. They had never explicitly defined what they were to each other, maintaining a careful friendship that both recognized had potential for more. Was that potential enough reason to uproot his life permanently? Or was he romanticizing a vacation, relationship that would inevitably face harsher realities if made permanent? The answer came unexpectedly, during a severe typhoon that flooded much of Manila. Anna's family home was in a low-lying area, and Mark found himself wading through waist-deep water, helping evacuate her elderly grandparents and salvage family photographs. For 3 days, he stayed with them in a crowded evacuation center, witnessing the Filipino resilience he had heard about, but never truly understood. Families sharing limited resources, communities organizing despite government inadequacies, humor persisting amid genuine hardship. When Anna's grandmother gripped his hand and thanked him in Tagalog, calling him anak, son, child, something shifted in Mark's perspective. He had been approaching his time in the Philippines as an extended tourist, always with one foot out the door. But that crisis had pulled him fully into the reality of life here. Not the sanitized expat version, but the authentic experience with all its difficulties and unexpected beauty. The following week, Mark declined his company's request to return. Instead, negotiating a permanent remote position with occasional trips back to headquarters, he signed a 1-year lease on a more modest apartment closer to Anna's family. These weren't decisions about a relationship alone, but about the person he was becoming, someone who had learned to see beyond his American-centered worldview and find value in a different way of living. Was this transformation the right choice? Mark wasn't certain, but for the first time in years his decisions were driven by genuine connection rather than obligation or expectation. Whatever came next, whether his relationship with Anna blossomed or not, he had finally stopped being a spectator in his own life. 1 year after arriving in the Philippines, Mark watched the sunset from his Quezon City apartment balcony. Manila's chaos had become his familiar soundtrack. Jeepney horns, vendor calls, and neighborhood basketball games now felt like home. His relationship with Anna had evolved naturally beyond friendship, though cultural differences required constant navigation. He learned that Filipino love was expressed not just through words, but through acts of service and practical support. Anna showed she cared by bringing home-cooked meals when he worked late and including him in family celebrations. Their greatest challenges centered on finances. Despite equal education, Mark earned substantially more than Anna. When he offered to pay for expensive things, she sometimes bristled, sensitive to stereotypes about foreign men buying Filipino companionship. When they split expenses proportionally, he worried she spent too much of her salary. "It's not about the money," Anna explained during one difficult conversation. "It's about dignity and how others see us. When people see an American man with a Filipino woman, They make assumptions. I need to know we're together because we choose each other, not because of what you can provide. They eventually found balance. He covered more household expenses, while she maintained financial independence through her career. Family presented another complex dimension. Anna's parents had gradually accepted Mark, especially after he helped during the typhoon. Yet they occasionally made comments about marriage that created pressure. Meanwhile, Mark's family remained skeptical about his choice to stay, his mother asking when he would come back to real life. Did he truly belong here? Despite improving Tagalog, Mark missed nuances in group conversations and cultural references. Certain Filipino customs still confused him, yet he found himself defending these same elements when other expatriates complained without trying to understand. Many expats lived in privileged bubbles, viewing Filipinos primarily as service providers, rather than equals. Mark increasingly distanced himself from these circles, preferring authentic connections through Anna. Professionally, Mark began volunteering at a technical school teaching programming. When a position opened to develop a curriculum, he surprised himself by applying. The job offered less money, but would root him more deeply in Philippine society. Was he prepared for that commitment? As he contemplated these questions, Anna joined him on the balcony with a cold San Miguel beer. They watched children playing below, neighbors chatting outside homes, vendors selling evening snacks. "Are you happy here?" she asked simply. Mark considered, carefully. Happiness wasn't the carefree fantasy he'd imagined from those early YouTube videos. It was something more textured, challenging and rewarding, frustrating and beautiful. His life spanned two worlds now, creating something unique between them. The future remained unwritten, but Mark had stopped waiting for his real life to begin. He had learned that genuine connection across difference was possible, difficult but profoundly worthwhile.